There's only two ways to look at what's happening in Kursk right now regarding Putin. He's either so discombobulated that he doesn't know how to act, or he doesn't care. Okay, welcome everyone to the latest episode of Headlines in History with your host, John Malik. Okay, we're back this week, and we're back into the headlines in history. We finished our series on Iraq, the 6 episodes. I hope you enjoyed them. If you haven't listened yet, go back. Talked about a lot of personal experiences, what it was like to go to drum and get down range, what the environment was like, the threat environment in 2005, and some really tragic stories along the way. So if you want to know what Operation Iraqi Freedom 3 was, how it affected the Middle East, how it affected the 42nd Infantry Division, my unit, National Guard as a whole, go ahead and take a listen. And then last week, we had a great conversation with Hannah Studley out of Jerusalem. She's a trauma counselor who spends time working with soldiers and civilians on PTSD issues, well-being, self-care, those type of things. Now, I wanted to get a little bit more specific on Jerusalem and what it was like to live there, in particular because of the threat environment, obviously living in Jerusalem with safe rooms and the rest of it. But we really ended up focusing a lot on the self-care and well-being, which I thought was useful, even though it's not so directly tied to our thesis or our mission here, but I thought it was worthwhile nonetheless, and Hannah's a great guest. So look for her episode last week, and potentially we'll have another conversation in the future more specifically about what it's like to live in Jerusalem, okay? But let's transition back, right? Let's get into the headlines and history aspect of this whole show. And we have to talk about, because there's no other topic, right? We have to talk about what's happening in Kursk in Russia, right? I was going to say in Ukraine, but that's really the whole point. Kursk is actually in Russia. Everyone is talking about it when it comes to the foreign affairs landscape. Military conflict. Iran has yet to respond to Israel. We've been waiting on that. And that hasn't happened since the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, which happened a few weeks ago. Of course, Iran came out and said it was going to respond. It was going to shoot at Israel. One of the interesting reasons, or one of the reasons we wanted to talk to Hannah, but that has yet to happen. So we await why, really. There's some conversations about negotiations that continue to happen. We see some optimistic language, or we hear some optimistic language come out of the Middle East and Israel in particular, and Secretary of State, the United States, whatever. And then we have Hamas respond and say, disregard all of that. It's not going to happen. So, but amongst all of that, or in the midst of all of that, is no response from Iran. At least no known response, no overt kinetic response that has yet to happen. So we'll see. And so what that has done is it's opened up the aperture, and now we're really focused again in the foreign affairs world on Russia and what's happening along that battle line. And clearly, if you're a fan of this show, if you listen regularly, then you have every reason to understand what's happening in Kursk. So, we're going to have to talk about it. I want to talk about it in some particular ways, though, that are a bit different than when you're going to get on other shows. I want to talk about the military aspects of the attack, so we're going to get a little bit more detailed. I'm going to cover some of the things that other people have been describing, some of the opinions that others have had about what's really happening there. And then, of course, because we're a history show, in part, we're going to talk about what this incursion, as some have said, or some penetration or raid or what other language, all the language that's being used, what this means in relation to some of the events that have happened in history, right? So we'll cover some of those. Okay, before we start, even though I remain in the business, remember, I don't speak for the DoD, I don't speak for the military, I don't speak for the intelligence community in any way. Anything that I talk about here today is solely my opinion. And it's all open source information that I'm gathering my information from, and you can find it anywhere online that you like. I'm only speaking for myself, as I always do. Okay, so you've heard it in the news, right? August 6th, the Ukrainian military has decided to go on the offense, right? And what I want to do here, I want to explain this not in generalized terms that you've heard on some of the other news sites, the legacy media, mainstream media, whatever you call it, where these pontificators are talking about, incursions and penetrations and raids and whatever. So what I want to talk about today, let's talk about it in American military doctrine. Let's use the language that the American military uses, which is tied very closely to how NATO operates, right? The foundational aspects of military operations within NATO are American and British doctrine, but really American doctrine. And yes, Ukraine is not in NATO, but they are being trained by NATO countries, okay? So let's look at it through the eyes of the Ukrainian military planners and how they looked at the landscape, how they came to their decisions in this American doctrinal framework, all right? So August 6th wasn't a penetration or an incursion or a test. What it was an attack. Again, in American military language. There are 4 different ways that you can conduct a military operation, or 4 different tasks, if you will, 4 different operations that you can conduct. One is the offense, one is the defense, one is stability, and one is defense support to civil authorities, right? Those are the 4 blocks that the American military uses, descriptions, as what the military can do, right? And then all of the sub-operations, all of the plans, all of the ambushes, all the tactical tasks, we call them, all of these things fall within these 4 blocks: offense, defense, stability, and defense support to civil authorities, right? Civil authorities. Defense support to civil authorities is what you might imagine. This is when the military comes in a federalized status, and it helps law enforcement not conduct criminal investigations, but helps law enforcement and, again, civil authorities respond to domestic concerns. Most of the time it's weather, but it could be physical security in some way. It could be helping to reduce rampant crime. It does tie into the Insurrection Act, kind of, if you want to get a little political, but nonetheless, that's 1/4. Another fourth is stability, and stability is usually the operational environment that's created after an offense or a defense has happened. Right? So you have an offense that maybe transitions to a defense, and then stability. The most recent example would be Iraq in 2003 or Afghanistan in 2001. The United States entered into Afghanistan with conventional forces in about November of 2001. They conducted an offense when they were fighting kind of a conventional fight, if you will, against the Taliban. And then once the Taliban were eradicated, they were pushed out of power. The American military and the Brits and NATO, they transitioned to stability operations and all of the things that come with that: rebuilding a government, reestablishing security, all those things. But on the August 6th operation, Ukraine went on the offense. They've been in the defense mainly, generally speaking, from a strategic standpoint. They've been on the defense since the invasion in 2022, but they decided to take a part of the battle space and go on the offense. And they did that by crossing the border and heading into Kursk, which is a very famous city in regards to military history, because one of the largest attacks in all, or one of the largest battles rather, in all of history, and certainly in World War II, and it was a tank battle, happened in Kursk after Operation Barbarossa. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but nonetheless, so Ukraine decided to go on the offense. And in American military doctrine, again, similar to NATO, there are 4 operations, there are 4 types of offense that you can have. Okay, there's a movement to contact, there's an attack, there's a pursuit, and there's an exploitation. Okay, and they all have very different goals and different reasons to exist, right? Movement to contact, that is basically an offensive operation that is designed to move through a part of the battle space where you are looking to see if you can find the enemy. You don't necessarily know where they are. You know that they're around. You know they may be in the defense. You know they may be in a certain city or a certain town, or if you're even on the squad level, you don't know if they're on your certain trail or maybe they're on another trail. So you're moving in such a way that you're waiting to get in contact with the enemy. And there are certain formations that you're going to use. There's certain type of weapons that you're going to use. But nonetheless, there's very little information, at least tactically, where the enemy is located. All right? That's not the type of offense that Ukraine used. They went into the attack. And the attack is very easy, right? That's either to destroy or defeat your enemy or to secure a key terrain. Those are the 3 main things that you're looking to conduct, or the 3 main goals you're looking to reach if you're going to go on the attack. You're either going to defeat the enemy, destroy the enemy, or secure key terrain. Or you can do a combination of both. But nonetheless, that's what you're looking to accomplish. And that's exactly what the Ukrainian military did when they crossed the border into Kursk. They were looking to seize key terrain, so they went on the attack. Now, just very quickly, what's the difference for those that are maybe new to the show and don't have the history in terms of the military terminology? There's a difference between defeat and destroy. Okay, so if you're going to destroy the enemy, that is putting them in such a position where they cannot reconsolidate and they can never affect the battle space again. They are completely eliminated, they're gone, and there's nothing that's going to happen that's going to bring them back. That's the definition of destroy from a doctrinal definition. Defeat is removing the ability of the enemy to continue to fight, but potentially could have the ability to fight again later. Maybe they would be resupplied, maybe they can conduct a withdrawal, and then they would end up being, again, resupplied, and they could end up licking their wounds, if you will, gathering more support. More units would reinforce them, and then they can go back on the offense potentially. That's the definition of defeat, right? So there's a difference between defeat and destroy. And then there's seize key terrain. So there may have been a subtask when Ukraine went into Russia on August 6th to defeat the enemy if they come across them. I don't think there was any intent to actually destroy the enemy. That requires a lot of work and effort. But they were looking to seize key terrain and possibly take advantage of whatever enemy units were around inside the city or protecting the city to defeat them in that time and space. Maybe they'll have the ability to fight again later. So as you're listening to the media and you hear all of these descriptions of what happened during the week, this is doctrinally what it did. It went on the attack. Now, when talking about these other media outlets, one thing I want to make sure everybody knows, if you're paying attention to this stuff, if you're watching the news, if you're listening to podcasts like this, or you're reading, blogs or whatever, the vast majority of everybody on the open source network, if you will, that's getting all of their information from journalists or whatever, most of what we're getting is from the Russian military bloggers. And all of the main outlets are from smaller podcasts like our show here, or all the way up to the New York Times, or the Telegraph in the UK, which I happen to listen to their podcast pretty often. They're all getting it from Russian mill bloggers. And there's an effort to determine whether these mill bloggers really are who they claim to be. But what I want everybody to know is that there are a lot of opinions out there, and they're based on really the same amount of information. Right? You're not going to get verifiable, high-quality evidence or data unless you're living in the classified world, okay? There's some verifiable data through what we call the geospatial domain. So if you're using satellites to take images, and there may be some data on those images, but nonetheless, just images from space, and there are civilian satellites out there that you can access on the internet, some of that is verifiable in that you can geolocate an image on top of a certain map, right? And you can say, well, this image was taken of the center of Kursk on this date, and I saw these individuals in the picture. You could feel pretty confident that what's happening on the ground in that place is likely happening, right? You'd be going through a lot of effort to try and fake a bunch of satellite images and post them all over the internet. So when institutes like the Study of War, Institute for the Study of War, which is a great website, and I'll reference during this episode today, and I'll put the link in the show notes, they use a lot of geotagged geospatial imagery to confirm what they think they're seeing. Okay, so that's good stuff. But when it comes to the context, when it comes to what's actually happening, because some human wrote it down and put it on a military blog, it's really challenging to determine if that stuff is true or not. Okay, so just take it all with a grain of salt. And when I say true, and let me split that into two different ways. I mean, one way I mean true in that it is accurate. Okay, so there may be a military blogger who is authentic. He's sitting in a foxhole somewhere. He has access to his cell phone, or he writes a letter to somebody and they have access to a cell phone, and they write some information about what happened or what they saw that day. I mean, we have to... potentially what that person wrote may not actually be accurate. They just got it wrong, right? Or partially wrong. And the other way is nation states could be playing, and often do play, as we've talked about here on the show, could be playing games in terms of information operations. Okay, who's to say there isn't an information operation mission going on right now in Russia that a bunch of fake mill bloggers are posting information online and saying the Ukrainians are winning or the Ukrainians are losing or these tanks are here or they're not. And some news media outlets grab a hold of that person's handle and they start talking and regurgitating what they say and they believe it's true. Who knows? Now, I'm sure that happens more often in the less professional world of journalism, but nonetheless, I just bring it up to say none of us are really going to know what's happening until it's over, right? Either you work in a classified area and you have access to what the United States or the British or the French or whatever they have in terms of their classified holdings. You either have that or you have Russian mill bloggers, and we're just all doing our best, okay? So let's set the stage, right? So this conflict, this part of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia began in February 2022, right? We all know that, when Russia illegally invaded Ukraine after their initial incursion or their initial attack into Crimea in 2014, whatever. And ever since, Ukraine has strategically, at least, been on the defense. It's been defending its homeland. It's been defending its country for over 2 years now, approaching 2.5 years. Now, there have been some other operations that are, let's call them sub-operations within this greater defense, right? Sometimes there's, special forces raids, there, small brigade size or battalion size elements go on the offense. But generally speaking, Ukraine is on the defense as it's looking to defend itself against the Russian invasion, okay? But for the first time, any large-scale unit, and I would say large-scale in this conflict would be probably brigade or larger, which for those that don't know, brigade is like you're talking about 3,500-ish soldiers, depending on your country and the type of the brigade and the associated equipment, but it's about 3,500. Any brigade-size element or more, Ukraine has taken and advanced into Russia. Okay, so there are some key points here, or key historical points here. You may have heard it's the first time that anyone other than Russian forces have been on Russian landscape, have been on the Russian territory since World War II. It's true. Yes, it's a big deal. It's also the first time a non-nuclear country has attacked into a nuclear country ever, and that is true as well. But what Ukraine decided to do, and what it looks like from what we can see from these satellite images and from the information we're getting from the front, they decided to take a section of the forward line of troops, the FLOT, or they're calling it the zero line, where it was lightly defended, where Russia wasn't paying close attention, and to gather a bunch of disparate units, it looks like, potentially up to 6 brigades, and attack into Russia. And they did it, again, against a lightly defended part of the line. So this is up in the north, where right on the border of Russia into the Kursk Oblast, which the province, right? The province of Kursk. And where a lot of the activity, or most of the activity, at least conventional force-on-force activity is happening, is into the south in Donetsk and Kharkiv. And the reason that there are parts of the line that are less heavily defended are because you only have so many assets. So first of all, Russia has not mobilized its entire military. It has not gone into a full draft. This has been talked about many times. And it has limited resources, especially since there are times when Russia is losing up to 1,000 personnel a day, either killed, captured, or wounded, that they don't have the personnel to defend across the entire border between Ukraine and Russia. So where the most fighting is happening, that's where the most resources go. And Russia has to prioritize not only its forces, but its collection assets, its sustainment routes, logistics, all that stuff has to be prioritized. You have limited resources. So if one part of the line is going to be heavily defended, then there's going to be parts that are lightly defended, okay? And so Russia decided that further in the north, near Kursk, it wasn't going to defend as much because it's not part of the priority in terms of Russia attacking into Ukraine. So I've described Ukraine went on the attack, and they did that to seize key terrain and potentially defeat enemy forces that were there. And what they did, from the reporting that we've seen, is it looks like they've engaged parts of about 6 brigades, okay, two of which we've seen the names of pretty often. So the 22nd Mech Brigade and the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. The 22nd Mech, for you military folks out there, it's got about 3 mech battalions, 1 tank battalion, and it has a rifle battalion. The 82nd Air Assault Brigade is designed similarly, although it's lighter than the Mech Brigade, as you might imagine. And then there's 4 more, but they're not full brigades, right? And so in total, right, there are assessments out there that say approximately 15,000 soldiers in total have been a part of this attack into Russia over the last couple of weeks. And 15,000, if you're to put that together, is about a division-size element. So parts of 6 brigades, 1 division. The 82nd, in particular, has some pretty advanced equipment. It has the Challenger 2, which is the British tank. It has Strykers. It has Marder 143s, which is a German APC. And it also has American M119s, which is the 105 millimeter howitzer with about a 17-click range. Those Challenger 2s have been highly touted, right? Even more so than the Abrams conflict between Russia and Ukraine, mainly because the Abrams doesn't have all of the equipment it traditionally has. Nonetheless, the Challenger 2 looks pretty effective in the battle space, and now the Challenger 2 is in Russia, right? So there's a morale boost for you if you ever had one, that not only are Ukrainian soldiers in Russia, but now you've got British tanks and American howitzers running around actual Russian battle space. Okay, so about 15,000 soldiers, and if you look at the battle space now too, after they've crossed into Kursk, they're about 17 to 20 clicks inside of Russian territory. And there's discussions, there's assessments going on as to how many total square kilometers. There's some conversation about 1,000 total square kilometers. There's different assessments out there. Some have been able to confirm about 800. The Ukrainians say about 1,000. Institute of Study of War says about 1,000. But it looks like it's about 17, 20, 25 clicks deep. And then obviously there's a stretch along the border that gives you up to 1,000. But What's interesting is it's about a division size element, right? With about a division size depth into Russia. A division usually operates anywhere between 20 to 25 clicks deep, can stretch a little bit further, but that's about where you want to go. And the howitzers they brought with them have about a 17 click range. So it all matches. And what I'm trying to get at here, other than just pointing out the obvious, is that the Ukrainians clearly planned this operation effectively. They knew exactly how much battle space they wanted to take, about a division size and depth. They brought the right equipment to do it. They had a light mech force, they had a light brigade and the air assault brigade. Then they had the mech brigade come in, and then there's plenty of artillery with the capacity and the howitzers to reach the end of the division line, if you will. And because there are 6 different brigades, you have the ability to conduct joint force operations, which is a real challenge for those militaries that don't have the training and the capacity to do it. Russia, one of the faults that it has, and the reason that it's losing so many personnel every single day against the Ukrainian forces, NATO-trained Ukrainian forces, 1, they have conscripts who have no idea what they're doing, but 2, they don't fight in the joint environment well. They do not do a good job of integrating the ground domain, the air domain, the maritime domain, and now we have the cyber domain and the information warfare domain. Russia does a pretty decent job at working within their services alone and individually rather well. And sometimes they do things within a singular domain rather well. They do a pretty decent job at cyber by inserting malware in certain units. They do it strategically against the United States. They do a pretty good job in information warfare where they're, filling the internet with dis and misinformation. They do a pretty good job of throwing a bunch of soldiers into a meat grinder, but that's only one service and one domain. They have a real challenge integrating the air domain for intelligence collection and then the cyber domain in order to, conduct electromagnetic warfare, EW warfare against the Ukrainians, and combine that all. The Ukrainians are doing it much better, and they're doing it because they're trained by NATO. And NATO has a very good experience. NATO's very capable, okay, particularly because of the United States, Aussies, Brits. They're very capable in conducting joint operations. And let me take a step back here to preempt any calls that, I'm just a homer for the U.S., although that would be probably obvious, right? But if you look at the invasion of Iraq in 2003, right, that was clearly not only just a joint operation, meaning multi-service, but that was a combined operation, multi-country. We made it, we being the United States and allied forces, we made it to Baghdad within weeks, right? And we were able to push Saddam out and find him in a spider hole weeks later and completely eradicate the Iraqi military within weeks. Not that challenging in terms of the history of warfare, right? The same was the case in November of 2001 against the Taliban. Now, arguably, the Taliban is nowhere near the capacity of the Iraqi military, but nonetheless. And the same thing happened in Desert Storm, even though we decided not to go to Baghdad. It only took 100 hours to finish the operation. We bring in 500,000 soldiers. We line up on the border of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and off we go. Done. Right? The Russian military comes in, and the only comparison we have between them and us is what happened in 2022. They make it to the outskirts of Kyiv and then are stopped dead in their tracks and pushed all the way back. Okay, against a military you could say arguably was significantly smaller in Ukraine than just like the Iraqi military was less capable, smaller than the American military. The American military reached its end state, reached its operational success. Russia got nowhere near that. And I'm not just making this point here to say like, yay, America's good, Russia's bad. No, what I'm saying is there's a military capacity to this. The Americans are very good at joint operations. The Russians aren't. And they've demonstrated that on the battle space now, as they've not been able to push Ukraine back further into their country. And they ended up in this stalemate in which is almost traditional trench warfare like World War I, because they don't know how to conduct joint fires. They don't know how to integrate all the domains. And the Ukrainians, because they're being trained by NATO, are doing just that. And they were able to pull off a nice little attack, division-size attack into Kursk over the last couple of weeks, where Russians are just holding their hands up and surrendering, and Russia's been able to do nothing, figuratively nothing, to stop them. Okay, I'll give you another doctrinal explanation as to the effectiveness of what Ukraine is conducting here in Kursk. I told you there's offense, defense, stability, and DISCA. They went on the offense and they conducted an attack to defeat the enemy and seize key terrain. It looks as if they being Ukraine, has determined that whatever is around Kursk, whether it's Kursk city itself, because it's a meeting of many lines of communication between road and rail, maybe potentially they get to the nuclear facility that's close, although I don't think that's a priority. But nonetheless, they've determined that piece of territory is key terrain. They've seized that. And they did it with 4 characteristics. There are 4 characteristics of the offense when you're conducting attack that you need to meet in order to be effective, right? And when I say need, is like you're going to need at least a part of these characteristics in order to be successful, okay? And those 4 characteristics, again, in American military doctrine, is audacity. And I want to read them to you because it's important to understand the specific definition, okay? So the attack into Russia had audacity, the ability to assume risk to create opportunity with bold action. Perfect. The ability to assume risk to create opportunity with bold action. Clearly, the Ukrainians had audacity as part of their offense. 2, concentration. Sometimes this is called massing. Orchestrating forces or effects to create and exploit opportunity. I think they clearly had that. They brought together 6 different brigades. All of them may have not been whole, but 6 different brigades. And they exploited an opportunity, which was a weak part of the defensive line. They had surprise. Number 3, taking action that catches enemy forces off guard. That one's a simple explanation. They certainly did that. And then tempo. Maintaining a pace of operations that is faster than the enemy's, but not so fast that it cannot be sustained for as long as necessary to achieve all assigned objectives. Fast enough, but not too fast. Fast enough meaning faster than the enemy, but not too fast that you outrace your logistics or sustainment. They did just that. because it took much less time for the Ukrainians to get into this division-sized depth battle space than it was for Russia to react. So they had all four characteristics of the offense. No wonder they were successful. Now, another aspect of an attack, other than seizing key terrain and the four characteristics, you usually have what you call a main effort and a supporting effort. Okay, you can have multiple supporting efforts depending on the size of your operation and how you're looking to, what you're looking to accomplish. But at the very least, you're going to have a main effort and a supporting effort. And at this point, we don't have enough information from the military planners, clearly, that's classified, but we don't have enough information that's come out either through the journalists or whatever. We're going to have to get it when everything's over. We don't have enough to determine how this was designed, which was the main effort, which was the supporting effort. Was there a supporting effort within the units that entered Kursk, or was it something else? Now, what we saw was these 6 brigades ended up crossing the border on August 6th piecemeal. They started on August 6th, but it lasted a few days as they were pushing through these units, right? Pushing through these thousands of soldiers. But then what we got was some reporting in the south that Ukraine was also attempting to penetrate near Belgorod. Now, Belgorod, again, further south, has many more resources for the Russians. The Russians are in a stronger defense down there, and there's actually been ongoing fighting between Ukrainian forces and Russian forces near Belgorod. That was not the case in the north in Kursk. So we have to ask ourselves, is the attack into Kursk the main effort and the supporting effort was down in Belgorod? But Belgorod started about 72 hours after the initial fight, and it really didn't go far at all. They made it a few hundred or a few thousand meters, and then they were stopped. And they were stopped because the Russians had a much stronger defense, and then they were pushed back. So we could ask ourselves, was that another aspect of the attack? Was there a feint kind of into Belgorod to try and convince the Russians that the Ukrainians were going to attack across multiple aspects of the battle space? They were just trying to, or multiple sections of the border rather, and were they trying to confuse them from a leadership, command and control standpoint, potentially? Or did the Ukrainians feel that they were so successful in Kursk that they were going to attempt to be successful again down in Belgorod, and then they just weren't for whatever reasons, right? There were just more Russians or whatever. So we're not going to know, but either way, there was multiple axes of advance, if you will, in this operation, depending on what the point was, right? Even though we don't know exactly what the point of the Belgorod push was. Now, the one hot topic in this whole discussion about the push into Russia is about surprise. And that's because, as we've all been tracking over the last couple of years, the addition of drone warfare into today's current combat has really created what some analysts have called a transparent battle space, meaning that there are very few places that you could hide in today's warfare, because you have satellites everywhere, not only commercial satellites, but you have military satellites from a host of other countries flying around in low Earth orbit, taking pictures and video or images and video all over the place. You have air breathers, which are, your regular fixed wing aircraft taking video and pictures. And then you have drones all the way down. You have large drones, which are the size of 747s, all the way to these little tiny, individual person drones, if you will, that just are thrown by an individual soldier and can fly a few hundred feet in the air and take video. You can't go anywhere without everybody seeing what you're doing. And so it was assumed by most, really, even most military individuals like myself, that it would be a challenge, a real challenge, if not impossible, for a division-size element to cross into Russia without Russia knowing ahead of time and being able to do something about it. Okay, so there's a couple of discussions out there, a couple of potentialities, if you will, as to how they were able to accomplish this. One, and what seems, and they may be related, but one is that Russia did see, and the Russian military, and it seems to be that there's some reporting now coming out that the units that were around Kursk, the few that there were, did have or were reporting potential massing of Ukrainian soldiers on the border, Ukrainian assets on the border, and pushing that back up to higher, likely all the way up to Putin, and nobody wanted to believe it, right? And this has happened throughout history where if you don't expect something to happen, it's really hard for you to accept that it could, especially in military conflict. So, and if you don't want it to happen, there's another aspect of that. So if you don't think it could happen and you wouldn't really want it to happen, and then you get the data that, oh no, the Ukrainians are coming on the border, maybe you just kind of disregard it and you say, it's a training, or they're just fooling with our heads or whatever. So that's possible. The Russians didn't want to believe it. But also it looks as if the Ukrainians were able to mask the ability for the Russians to communicate and then pass the information to wherever they needed it to go, up to higher, once the attack began. And they did that through electronic warfare. They did that with the ability to break into, and when I say break, I mean break the line between communications along the front and potentially even the radars that were looking for the air assets and ground assets that were coming into and across the border. If that's the case, then what it looks like is that the transparent battlefield is only transparent when you're fighting an enemy that doesn't have the capacity to conduct EW, right? Electronic warfare. And if the Ukrainians if they were able to jam the comms and jam the radar, then you can move across the battle space wherever you like, because the only thing that you can't block is somebody with a set of binos. But even if you do, right? Even if the person with a set of binos can be looking across a ridgeline, they can see an entire company of tanks coming across. If you can't pick up your VHF or UHF radio and communicate back to battalion TOC and then up the chain, who cares, right? They're not going to be able to do anything about it. So if that was the case, it looks as if the Ukrainians were able to get into country. And when I say get into country, I mean with very likely their special operations forces, and get into Russia before the operation and plan to jam comms before the brunt of the operation, you will, and before they initiated the attack on August 6th. And the reason they would have to do that is because jamming comms is hard. Hard not only because you have to determine which frequencies they're using and those things, but it takes a little bit more energy, a little bit more power. And just the way that radio communications work, you kind of got to be closer to where they're happening. Let's just put it that way. And so you can't have some large fixed-wing aircraft flying over a battle space and jamming everybody's comms effectively. It doesn't necessarily work that way all the time, right? So the better and more effective way is to insert soft or have, certain equipment in place prior to an operation so you can jam the comms when you need to. Now, you can disrupt, you can jam radar, even though that's in the radio frequency as well. It's different in the way radar works. You can disrupt or block radar capabilities differently and with different equipment, and it doesn't need to be as close. But again, the comms piece is really challenging. So if that was the case, then the Ukrainians did a killer job. And it speaks back to the ability of Ukraine to conduct joint operations, right? Just the fact that they would have special operators in the battle space before the frontline troops or before, the armor and the infantry came across the border, that's a joint operation in and of itself, right then and there, because special ops are not conventional forces, so those are joint. And then you have the air aspect. That's another joint operation, okay? So let's summarize really quick. Ukraine went on the offense on August 6th, offense being one of four military operations that the at least in American doctrine that they're able to conduct. They went on the offense. They chose to attack. Attack is to defeat, destroy an enemy, or seize key terrain. They did just that. And they did it with the four characteristics of the offense, which is audacity, concentration, surprise, and tempo. They nailed it. Let's go through some of the more popular conversation items that have happened since this since this operation was conducted and as it's continuing to go on, and which ones that I think are more valuable or less valuable, which I think are maybe just talking heads. They have no idea what they're talking about, or maybe there are some out there that have made some really salient points. The first one would be why the Ukrainians conducted this operation, other than just the fact that they wanted to have a tactical win, right? And it could be as simple as that they were looking to just transition to the offense on one part of the defensive line, and they did that, and they got a tactical win. It certainly boosts morale, right? If you've been in a military unit, you've been in combat, there is a huge aspect, feeling confident that you could win and that you're not going to be defeated and that you're not going to potentially even die while you're conducting your operation is big. And so if you have, the Ukrainian leadership political military leadership is looking at its military forces that have been engaged in, again, trench warfare over the last 18, 24 months, if not more, where the plot has been rather stagnant. And then there's been a part of the line in the south near Donetsk and Kherson that are slowly losing ground to the Russians. You want to be able to switch your morale. You want to be able to kickstart it. And sending a division-size element into Russia absolutely did that for the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian citizens as a whole, as they get ready to approach what could be a pretty bleak winter. So that's true. It's also true that it's a morale killer for the Russian military. Now, when I say Russian military, I don't want to. It's not so much of an effect on the conscripts, and let's make that pretty clear. So some have said that this is sending a message to the Russian military as a whole. It's not so much the conscripts. The conscripts don't want to even be there in the first place. Right? These are people that are only fighting on the front line because they were arrested for some reason. And, given some of the reports that have come out of Russia, they weren't even arrested on legitimate purposes. Putin's just looking to put more people into the meat grinder. So some of these people don't even think they committed a crime. Now they're on the front line. They had 3 weeks of training. They're using a rifle they don't even know how to operate. Right. So there's no morale booster or anything for these people. They just want to get out of there. Okay. But it does send a message to the Russian leadership a bit. Okay. That those that are actually in the service, that are dedicated to defeating the Ukrainians, that have this, a mental desire, the hatred for Ukrainians for whatever reason, for religious or cultural aspects, then yeah, this sends a message. This says that in their lifetime, they've never had a foreign military walking around on their ground, right? From an American perspective, this is like saying, there's a division of Canadian forces in Montana, right? As much as we may love the Canadians, they're our friends, nobody wants that, and you don't want the Mexican military in Florida, okay? So it does send a message to those people, but it doesn't affect the entirety of the Russian military as it does the Ukrainian military. The other message that is sent, and that I would agree with that many are bringing up, is it sends a message to Western allies that Ukraine has the capacity to conduct effective operations against the Russians, and that they should be, that Western allies should continue to support the effort, right? There's certainly an aspect of those that are paying the bill, meaning the American taxpayer, the British taxpayer, everybody else in NATO. We just spent $61 billion in the last, 4 or 5 months ago that Congress passed that tranche of money that went over to Ukraine. You want to know what it's really doing, right? It's one thing to say, well, it's helping the Ukrainians, they haven't been defeated. Russia hasn't made it to Kyiv. That doesn't really send a stark message. Well, sending a division into Russia does, right? So this demonstrates that the training that NATO has been giving the Ukrainians in terms of how to conduct joint operations effectively sends a message that this is a winnable war for the Ukrainians. Now, winnable is a whole different discussion. Just generally speaking, this is a winnable war for the Ukrainians. Another strategic point that I think is valuable that has been brought up is the red line point. There have been a lot of analysts who have said this operation into Russia is has been described by Putin as one of the strongest, boldest red lines that could ever be crossed, and that Russia would respond with nuclear capabilities potentially if Ukraine ever decided to step foot inside of Russian territory. And that clearly didn't happen. And so this is really politically and strategically, this operation has put Putin on the back foot, because he's been promising since the beginning of this operation that if Ukraine/NATO made one step, two steps, three steps, whatever it was, if they gave them F-16s, that's a red line. If they gave them HIMARS capabilities, that's a red line. And damn, if you actually end up inside Russia, that's the biggest red line. And nothing's happened. Absolutely nothing's happened. And so this then ties back into the support element, not only financially from the United States and the taxpayers that are helping support Ukraine, but from a legal standpoint. It gives the impression, it gives the idea to leaders that may be holding back some weaponry, like the UK and the Storm Shadow as of today that we're recording here on August 18th, that the British have yet to allow the Ukrainians to use the Storm Shadow inside of Russian territory. Maybe this kind of loosens the grasp, if you will, and allows the Ukrainians to use it, because Putin has yet to say, or Putin has yet to actually live up to his red line conversation and do anything about it. So, and what's a bigger red line than actually attacking into Russia? There's very few I think you can come up with. So that's a win. Tactically, has it pulled some Russian forces from across the other parts of the border? It has. There's some information out there. I even saw some reporting yesterday, so this would be August 17th, that potentially Russians that were inside of Ukraine, not reserve forces, but that Russians that were inside of Ukraine were actually pulled off the border to come and reinforce the defense around Kursk. I can't verify that, but if that's the case, then Russia tactically is in a bad way, because they're slowly grinding along, again, down in the south and Donetsk and Kherson. And if they've got to pull some of those, some of those forces down there, that maybe that'll slow up their advance potentially. So this could be a win tactically for Ukraine, other than the fact that they would be holding this key terrain. Another thing to consider here is the Russian response. And there's been, some have said that the Russian response is non-existent, if you will. That's not true. There's actually fighting, and people are dying, both Russians and Ukrainians, as they fight in the area of Kursk. So this isn't some walk in the park. Okay, so let's understand that this is still combat. This is large-scale combat operations, and the Ukrainians are fighting against the Russians here in the Kursk area. They're just doing a very, very good job because it's lightly defended. So you ask yourself, if Putin is capable and his military is as strong as he claims it is, why haven't they stopped the Ukrainians? And there's really only two ways to think about it. Either one, he doesn't want to, and when I say doesn't want to, potentially because he doesn't care. Right? There's not a it can't be true that he doesn't want to for some strategic or tactical advantage. That's not the case. Okay, so he doesn't want to because it doesn't matter to him. That he is now determined that he wouldn't want the Ukrainians on his soil in the first place, but okay, now that they are, that's already been crossed. So I'm just going to continue to focus on the South, where I've always wanted to focus, and I'm not going to rearrange everything, because who really cares tactically if Ukraine owns Kursk? It doesn't really change anything ultimately, so he didn't do anything about it. Or it's because he can't. And I tend to lean on the side that he can't. I really do think, given the way that Putin describes his military, that if he had the capacity to boost or boot the Ukrainians back out and push them back across the border, that he'd do that. I don't think he can. I don't think he can, because he doesn't have the right forces in terms of the right training. He has conscripts that don't understand how to fight at the squad level, let alone fight at the platoon, company, battalion, brigade, division level, which as you go up in echelons, it becomes exponentially more difficult. And he just doesn't have the capacity. He doesn't have the ability to conduct joint fires. He doesn't have the ability to conduct command and control and what the Army calls mission command, the ability to actually lead and take advantage of all of these experiences and put together a cohesive fighting force. He doesn't have it, right? I mean, in the reporting this week said that he being Putin, wrested command and control from the military leadership in Kursk and gave it to himself. Okay, so he was making decisions on what happens in the battle space. All right, we all know from Vietnam and Nixon that this is a bad idea, and that he also put in charge the FSB. So now you have an internal security force, which he trusts more than he does the military, the actual conventional military, and probably has smarter and more capable, I shouldn't say probably, he does have in a lot of places smarter and more capable leaders. But the FSB is not a conventional military force, right? They don't understand division support areas. They don't understand log packs. They don't understand, joint fires. They don't get any of that, right? How do you integrate, SIGINT collection with human collection and conducting an all-source picture to answer questions for the boss to make decisions? They don't know how to do that in any real way. And so now you have the wrong people in charge of a bunch of conscripts who don't want to be there. And there's the reporting suggests the National Guard is involved. So now you have different services, a mess. And I really do think that Russia just doesn't have the capability. And Putin has been quiet. And I think there's a reason for that. He's quiet. He had some media time in the last couple of days, and he looked very frustrated in those things. But his bluster is gone, at least in the last couple of weeks. He's not banging on tables and talking about how he's going to, eradicate the Nazis from Russia and all of these things. I think he really understands, because he is, at the end of the day, a rational actor. I think he understands he's in a bad way, and he doesn't know what to do about it. If he doesn't have the ability to just push a button and make Ukraine go away and make them leave Kursk. And now he's given up, again, I'll speak tactically here, he's given up a part of the battle space that was originally two defensive lines were dug by Russian defensive forces, are now operated or owned rather by Ukraine. And they're now digging in and they're building up their defenses. And if you have a capable division plus size element digging into two trench lines that are not full of conscripts, and it's with a military that knows how to conduct joint fires, the Russians are going to be really challenged to try to get Ukraine out of that part of the battle space. And they're not. That would be my assessment, is that without the Russian military using the brunt force of all of its ground forces, that Ukraine's not going anywhere. They're just not going anywhere in the near term. They're going to get in, they're going to dig in, and you're going to have a log pack line. You're going to have sustainment coming across the border into Kursk. They're going to set this up in such a way that nobody's going to move them out of there until the end of this conflict. That's just not going to happen. All right, so let's get to the history part of this. What have we seen this in the past, right? And so let's look at some of the characteristics of what has happened here since August 6th. And if we can draw some connections to the past in other military conflicts to what's happening today. Well, one of the most talked about characteristic is surprise. Nobody thought, even the American military, the people that are watching this thing every single day that don't have access to live feeds and where military units are, nobody really thought Ukraine was going to go on the offense and they were going to attack into Russia. So they certainly gained the element of surprise. They gained the element of surprise strategically because no one thought they were going to do it. And then they had the element of surprise operationally and tactically because they made it into 10, 15 clicks into Russian territory without anybody being able to do anything about it. Okay. So that characteristic is the main one. And yes, there are a whole slew of surprise attacks that have happened throughout military history. If you listen to this show, I'm sure you can think of 1,000 of them that can semi-relate, right? I mean, what are some of the more famous surprise attacks in history? We can go all the way back to the Trojan horse, right? That was a huge surprise. You could talk about Chancellorsville in the Civil War, where Lee split his forces between Jackson and himself, and he attacked north against the core element. But that's not the same. I mean, obviously the Trojan horse isn't the same because it didn't work that way, right? There wasn't this small element that slipped inside behind the battle space. That's not the same. It's not Chancellorsville because the Ukrainians didn't split their forces in any real way, so that's not really similar. Pearl Harbor was a famous surprise to be even more recent, but that was different because one side of the fight wasn't even really in the war at that point, right? I mean, Pearl Harbor was an attempt to keep the Americans out of the war, but ended up getting them in, and so there's surprise, but it's not the same. And then you have the war of, let's say, the 6-Day War in 1967. That was a big surprise when the Israelis went in and basically obliterated the Egyptian Air Force before they could even get into combat. That's different because there was no fighting and the war ended in 6 days. That's not the case here. 9/11's a terrorist attack. So what are some that are like surprises that could have potentially changed the story and the narrative that are a little bit more closely related? I have a couple here that I think are similar. So the first, when I was looking and doing some research here, I thought that the Battle of Trenton was pretty good. There's some comparisons here, right? So, and if you remember the Battle of Trenton, this is the whole December, the night of Christmas Day, 1776, Washington has his forces coming out of Valley Forge, which was a complete low point in terms of the revolution. He brings about 2,400 soldiers, gets them to cross the Delaware in the dark of night, icy, and he attacks 14 Hessian German conscripts, basically mercenaries, really is a better way to describe it. So 1,400 Hessian mercenaries, they win at Trenton. It changes the morale, kind of flips the script a little bit and gives Washington the mentality, allows him to spread the mentality that the Americans have an opportunity to win this thing. So, some of the similarities are that Trenton didn't change the war, and I don't think the surprise attack into Kursk is changing the war either. In saying the way like Saratoga did in the Revolution, right? It was a great story, and it boosted morale, and it allowed the French and the Americans to realize that they could potentially pull this thing off, and that it was a great morale booster. Not only the tactics, and another thing that happened at Trenton is that Washington used a series of articles that was written by Thomas Paine at the time, The Crisis of America, and he gave them to all the soldiers to read prior to the attack at Trenton, and that also happened to boost their morale mentally before they even got into the fight. So who knows if that happened in Ukraine or not. But the point is, it didn't change the war. It was a brilliant surprise tactic, came from a group of soldiers that were certainly looking like they were going to be defeated. If you're to look at this thing holistically, most people would say Russia's winning the war, if you will. Again, it all depends on what you think winning means, but generally speaking, Russia had the ability to overpower Ukraine. So there's some similarities there. One that I think is a little bit even closer is the Incheon landing. So Korean War, 1950, if you remember, the South Koreans and the Americans were pushed all the way down into the Pusan Peninsula and the southeast of the Korean Peninsula. Okay, China, together with the North Koreans, right, started the war in 50, pushed the South Koreans and the Americans all the way down towards the bottom of the peninsula, almost completely off. Again, if not for this, just like 10%-ish of the southeast portion of the peninsula. And the United States, the Americans, came up with a pretty bold plan, and it's attributed to Douglas MacArthur, who, by the way, first Chief of Staff of the 42nd Rainbow Division. Douglas MacArthur to conduct a naval landing at the port of Incheon, way up on the west end north of Seoul, and on the west side of the peninsula, that would end up surprising the North Koreans, dropping a force in the behind the front line, obviously, and that would give them a short attack range into the capital of Seoul and would allow them to open up another logistics hub. Right now, the only way they could get supplies into the force on the peninsula was through that southeast portion because the North Koreans controlled everything else on the peninsula. So if they were open up another part of the beachhead, if you will, open up another beachhead, they can get supplies in, and it would create a dilemma as this Ukrainian attack has into Kherson, or excuse me, into Kursk, would create another dilemma for the North Korean and Chinese leadership to deal with, because it's not just a singular fight. Now they have to deal with a fight in two different areas. So the Incheon landing is considered one of the most brilliant naval operations, naval to ground operations in history, in modern history at least. And it really allowed the South Koreans and the Americans to fight back north where the conflict ended, on the 38th parallel and where it stands today. So it didn't bring complete victory, but it did shift some of the tactical advantage to the South and the Americans, and shifted the overall operation and gave the South Koreans a big win. I think that's a pretty similar example, if you will. Again, Ukraine is not changing the war with this operation, but it was highly effective. It's put Putin in a position where he has to deal with multiple different areas along the front. It's given him a dilemma. It opens up another logistic space where the Ukrainians can be sustained from another part of the forward line. It boosts morale. That absolutely was the case for the South Koreans and the Americans in Korea. And so I think that's a good example in history as to what's happened in Kursk. Now, the most famous battle to ever happen around Kursk, as I had mentioned in the outset, was after Operation Barbarossa. And even though the battle happened at the same place, and that it's really considered one of the largest tank battles of all time, and it was a big deal when Hitler and Stalin were going at it over this part of the landscape. It's not really that similar, right? This was two monster forces, two of the main forces that were fighting, again, armor forces, that didn't really have the same element of surprise. So there's just not a lot of, again, other than the location, there's just not a lot of aspects of the Kursk battle in World War II to the incident, to the operations that are happening today. So again, I think Incheon's a good one for modern history and even some of what happened at Trenton. Now, there's one commonality I want to put on offer here today, and it relates to the outcomes of all of the events, most of the events that I just described, the historical examples, and then the attack that's happened here in Ukraine. Do you know what it might be? It's not blatantly obvious, but it exists nonetheless. It's the argument, I won't call it a fact, but it's the argument that none of these events ended up with a decisive victory to the overall war. I would grant you maybe the 6-Day War, but that's just such a unique example. But nonetheless, in all of these, Trenton, Incheon, even Chancellorsville, in this event here in Ukraine, it didn't end anything. They were all operational and tactical successes, but not, and strategic in some ways, if you want to talk about morale and funding and other things, but not a strategic victory in the sense that it completed everything. Now, I want to give the credit here to an article I read in the Strategy Bridge. It was written in 2020 by Charles Vandepeer, James Reggins, and Matthew Utley, and it was titled "Surprise and Shock in Warfare: An Enduring Challenge." Okay. I'll link to it in the show notes. The thesis is that surprises are a challenge for the defense and an opportunity for the offense, but a surprise doesn't end up concluding the conflict. And I sat and I thought about that for a little while, and I wanted to find out why. I didn't really talk about in the article why that was the case. Just the fact that surprise is key to fighting in a tactical and operational environment, but didn't really get into why why it didn't really change the strategy. And I thought about it, and what it seems to me, and this is the case that's happening here in Ukraine, is that if you're conducting a surprise and it ends up, it doesn't always end up being effective, but if it does end up being effective, everybody talks about it. But if you're having to use the element of surprise to such an extent that everybody hears about it, it's such a big deal, then you're losing, right? I mean, why would you need the Trojan horse if you're winning? Why would you need to split your forces in an unconventional way? Why would Lee need to do that with Jackson if he's winning? Why would the Japanese need to attack Pearl Harbor if they were winning? They're not winning. And so while you may conduct surprises if you're winning on the offense, right? Maybe the United States used the element of surprise along with tempo and other things when it attacked into Iraq in 2003. But does anybody really remember the amazing surprises that the United States included in their operations in March of 2003 or November of 2001 in Afghanistan? No. But everyone remembers the Incheon landing as one of the greatest naval to ground operations and surprises in modern warfare. Why? Because the Americans were losing. The South Koreans were losing. Generally, the Ukrainians were losing. They want to get the Russians out of their country, and they couldn't. So they conducted a surprise, and now everybody's talking about it because it's the underdog story. And so, again, if you're the underdog, then you're likely the less effective military. And then, therefore, that makes sense why you wouldn't strategically change the outcome. Because you're not as good. You're not winning. And so that just kind of seemed to come to me. Now, I haven't done a scientific study on this, so don't email me and say you have no idea. I've got 1,700 books that says otherwise. I'm just saying, I was thinking about this while I was reading the article, and it just seemed interesting to me that throughout history, these surprise attacks, these surprise operations are tactically and operationally beneficial, but don't change the war. Now, could they end up being a part of the overall victory? Certainly. I think that's absolutely the case. But again, I think we need to understand that this is limited, again, to the tactical and operational part of the battle. The war in Ukraine is not ending today. It's not ending tomorrow. It's not ending in 3 months. It's just not the case given the landscape within the operational landscape today. Right? Winter is coming. The muddy season's coming. Then winter is coming. Right? This thing isn't ending anytime soon. And so we may see historians write the history of this battle in Kursk and say that was a potential turning point, or that was one of the greatest operations Ukraine had in the entire war against Russia. Potentially, absolutely. And it'll be written down in history books, and we'll all study it going forward. But it's not going to change anything in the strategic sense. The war's not ending tomorrow. It's not ending 6 months from now. It's probably not even ending a year from now. And who knows even how it's going to end. We're more optimistic, for those of us that support Ukraine, that Ukraine can pull this thing out. But that's not to say that anything's really going to change. Okay. Thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it. If you have any questions about what we talked about today, if you want me to explore different areas, let me know. John Moloch at headlinesinhistory.com. You can reach out to me at any time. If you want to support the show, I would be really, really appreciative. You can go to the Patreon site, Headlines in History Podcast at Patreon. I just had a conversation with my buddy from Dark History, so he sent me the script, and we're doing some planning. So don't forget, we're going to have this conversation about the Battle of Saratoga. I think it's going to be really good. Also, I have an upcoming conversation with somebody in terms of what's going on in Venezuela right now. This is a real key aspect in the southern Western Hemisphere, and it affects what's going on in South America and the Caribbean, as you've probably been following. The potential re-election rate of Maduro, which really didn't happen and no one says did happen, and it's really causing some significant unrest in Venezuela. So I've got a conversation with a really smart person that studies this part of the world very closely coming up in the next couple of weeks. So stay tuned. Again, thanks for joining us this week here on Headlines in History, and I'll talk to you next week.